Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Morgan, host of the Alzheimer's World Summit, and I'm very privileged to have here today Dr. Arenander, who has a PhD in neuroscience from UCLA and director of the Brain Research Institute. He's also been involved in teaching and research on human development for the last 40 years, and also one of the early and most fundamental researchers on the TM Transcendental Meditation Program with brainwave research and the physiological impact of this technique. So welcome, Alaric.
Thank you, Michael. It's a great joy to be with you and your audience.
Can you share with us how you got involved in brain research originally?
Yeah, everybody's path in life takes interesting twists, and early in mine, we had some family things that occurred. And even in those young years, I go, something's not right. There's, we understand there's a certain uncertainty about all the change around us, but the question is that did anybody have a grip on that? Because we're trying to control all the change, but I found out earlier nobody really had a grip on any of it, especially the big questions like how do we age and why are people unhappy and how do you make people happy? It was pretty much up for grabs. I go around, ask all kinds of people, adults that had very intelligent degrees, and I say, what's the solution here? And by the time I got out of my head out of books in college, I looked around, I go, man, this world really needs some help. And I looked around and said, what were the possibilities to really help this world be more harmonious, to remove the suffering, to lengthen the aging process? So that led me to the brain, obviously, because the brain seems to be very important to that nexus. And it also led to the question of what can you do for the brain that'll allow it to perform better, so that we could overcome these perpetual, perennial, historical issues of human suffering and disharmony and lack of happiness and fulfillment. So just kept digging into the brain, and then I ran into meditation, transcendental meditation, and then right away I go, wow, now here is something that actually works, it's simple, it's scalable, and it was never mentioned before. Even though it's age old, it was never part of civilization's ongoing throw into the material world. But if you join it with the material outward movement of activity, it brings great stability and great progress. So that's where I find myself.
Well, and it sounds like you've done a lot of studying on the aging process itself, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, is aging complicated? I guess that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. Yes or no? Like, what about that?
Yeah. I remember this is Professor Caleb Finch at USC in Los Angeles, and he was a big aging guy back. That's like 50 years or 40 years ago. And I said, Caleb, what's the story with aging? Because there was all this research down hormones and how things were working in aging and things were falling apart. And he says, look, if you don't get a heart attack, you don't get X, Y, and Z, you're going to fall off the ladder. Sooner or later, something's going to go wrong, and it'll be the end. So it's just that was a progressive dysfunction of the system, whether you want to think about it in terms of hormones or brains or thinking. It was falling apart. So aging in one sense is very complicated if you think about the brain. 100 billion brain cells. And they're all trying to work together to create your next thought and to fulfill your life's goals and so forth. But think about it, if you had a person and you had another person, and the way you communicated with that other person was you said yes or no. And so you talk to one person, they say yes or no, are we going to go? And then all of a sudden another person comes into your environment and they go yes or no. And then you have 10 more people and they're all saying yes or no. And you're trying to compute all these yes or no's. And then maybe you expand it out to 100, maybe 1,000, maybe 10,000 people all of a sudden saying yes or no to you. And you're trying to think, no, is it a yes or is it a no? What are we doing here? Huge amount of flow of information, of possibilities, even on the level of yes and no. And some brain cells, they have 500,000 inputs at every moment. And I mention every moment because that moment's gone. Now you have another set of yes and no's. So each brain cell is confronted with a huge influx of information. And how that information is integrated is beyond our comprehension right now. They just published a paper on AI, and they threw all the AI at a single brain cell. and they couldn't even compute what it was doing.
Hmm.
So even AI, as sophisticated as today, can't even figure out one single brain cell and what it's trying to do. So basically, it's very complex, huge information flow. The brain is wired to process information. It has wires and connections and little mini computers all over the place. That combination gives us our life. And when it doesn't work well, that's called aging. Now, on the other side, although the whole thing is very complex and we really don't understand all that amount about the brain because it is such a huge black box, it is still very simple, this whole aspect about aging and Alzheimer's. Because the problem can be simply shown as we have two stages in our life. Between 0 and about 30 years, things become more and more connected, more and more integrated, more and more powerful. And then around 30, there's a plateau, and then individual brains and people experience a certain trajectory downwards, either very sharp or very flat. But there's this phase of connectivity and a phase of disconnectivity, growing order, growing disorder. So life is pretty simple, actually. We do well, or sort of well in the beginning, and then things start falling apart. So basically what we need to do is to harness the intrinsic, unimaginable ability of the brain to be plastic and to change, because every moment is changing. In fact, they suggest that at the end of a year, almost all your connections have changed.
Hmm.
You can imagine the amount of complexity and neuroplasticity involved in our moving forward through life. We want to move forward with more and more order, not more and more disorder.
And it sounds interesting. It's almost like a computer analogy where you're looking at an individual on off, yes, no, that's the way computers work. It's very digital.
Mhm.
Then you multiply that by millions and even trillions and look at the possible permutations.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think of aging as that sum of all that information processing being processed over time.
There's an estimate that the computing power of a single human brain, somebody watching this video right now in your series, they're watching, they have a brain. The computing power of that person's brain, even if it's not fully realized, is considered to be equivalent to more than all the computers on the planet right now in that one brain. And so how do we access that computing power and use it to be happy and fulfilled and long-lived? That's the key.
And I have to interject, I talk a lot in my longevity series about reversal of the aging process.
Uh-huh.
And so, the way that I kind of joke about it is that after a certain age, the common paradigm at the moment is that after a certain point, you kind of go downhill. So there's more entropy.
Typically, yep.
So for someone to actually challenge that or bring up a concept that you can reverse the aging process, as you've touched on, it's kind of interesting. I'd like you to expound on that a little bit. Like, how is it possible for the brain and the entire physiological system to kind of like go against the grain, so to speak, and actually reverse the aging process?
Excellent thought. The key here is that we're working on the last 1,100 years of human experience and scientific evidence. And so we're taking what we know now based on life as we know it. But life as we know it has two basic problems. And in fact, those problems are getting more exacerbated every day. One, we have stress, and we have really no good means of dealing with that except for self-medication of different ways, which have side effects. So we have stress, and stress is known to kill brain cells, destroy things, hurt the cardiovascular system, and so forth and so on. So stress has never been fully engaged in terms of resilience and removal of stress. And it's growing. So the first problem is we're beating the brain, we're beating the nervous system, we're creating more and more disorder every day because of our inability to handle the dynamic change, the acceleration of change in this age of acceleration. So it's only going to get harder and harder. That's one problem. The other problem is we've never really found a way to fully develop the human brain through our educational system. I mean, we spend 20 years maybe educating people. And at the end of that, what do we have to show for it? The human race as we know it now. So obviously the education, what we're doing to cultivate a brain development has never been fully successful. And that's how this meditation issue comes in, because it's been shown that you can actually fully develop a human brain through meditation, if done properly, in a very simple, systematic way, effortlessly. You can increase the intelligence, you can increase the creativity, you can increase the morality, you can increase the attention, you can increase the awareness, you can increase the sense of self, and motivation. Everything can be increased if you just access this simple ancient technology which has modern scientific validation.
And we had spoken a little bit before we started the interview. There's a concept of neuroplasticity, and then there's a concept also a little more recently of neuroadaptability. Being able to adapt to a stressor in a faster frame of time. And I'm wondering, you told me even in the mid 1970s, you found something out about meditation and its ability to have more of a positive effect on the aging process. I wondered if you could mention that a little bit.
Sure, I'll be happy to, Michael. So back in the middle 70s, I found myself at a research institution in Switzerland. And I'd taken some time off from being at UCLA in my graduate studies to do some research in Switzerland on meditation. And what we found, that's like 45 some years ago, two important things. And this is a long time ago now. First, that published research at that point, if you look at all the variables that predict the quality of aging, you lose some hearing and the skin gets like this and this hormone does this, the brain does this. If you look at all the variables that predict aging, that transcendental meditation, people who practice transcendental meditation twice a day, the aging process was reversed. All the things that created the aging as we know it now, which is inappropriate, were reversed. So if something was going up and that was bad, it would go down. Something was going down and that was bad, it would go up with meditation. So we knew back in 1975 that we could reverse the aging process. Second, in 1975, we were doing research on the brain waves, and for the first time published that when you practice this simple form of meditation, the brain becomes remarkably, sustainably, maximally coherent, means maximally orderly. The brain became this large, global, integrated information processing machine through the practice of TM, transcendental meditation, and that when we went back into life, that experience of maximum coherence was stabilized in the person's life, which gave rise to increased intelligence, increased coherence in their thinking and behavior and their emotions and so forth. So back in the middle 70s, we knew that we could reverse the aging process. It was proven. And we knew that now we probably had a mechanism, brain coherence, brain orderliness. If the brain is more orderly, things are more connected, information flows, you are happier, and things work better. If you don't have that information flow on a global level, then things start getting out of whack and we have problems in the suffering and unhappiness and unfulfillment.
It's interesting when you bring up this point, like the correlation between the brain and body, because when we talk about entropy, and disorderliness and things falling apart as you age, it's an interesting concept that if the brain is more orderly and coherent, it's somehow reflected in the body. And that's reflecting on all the factors with aging. Like I know when I speak about aging in some of my classes, I talk about, well, there's neuroskeletal muscular and what happens there, and vision, and hearing, and balance, and continence, incontinence. All these things tend to reinforce each other either in a negative way or a positive way. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how coherence in the brain waves is found in the body, because I think that's a positive thing for people to know about in terms of their health.
So the brain runs the body. And of course, the body feeds information to the brain and has an influence, right? Normally, our brain runs our respiration, but if you do certain respiratory exercises, it can actually have profound influence on the brain. So it's a two-way street, but this is the central government. This is the national government, and these are little state, local things. And they all want their domain and their control, but they're run by the state, by the government, the main central government. And so if this is more orderly, it interprets the environment of the body and the outside environment in such a way that it maximizes harmony inside and outside. So we live a happy life outside, and the body is getting what it needs: nutrition, rest, exercise, whatever dietary situation it needs. It's more sensitive. When the brain is more orderly, everything is more adaptive. Everything is more adjustable. Everything is more working together, as opposed to fighting each other and trying to deal on their individual level. So basically, the brain is running the body. If the brain is orderly, the body is orderly.
And that's going to support an aging process, which takes that peak at 30 or 35 years of age and continues to optimize how the
Yeah.
body functions.
Yeah, basically the brain, as you mentioned, neuroplasticity, whatever experience you have, if you think about blue, that'll have an almost insignificant influence on your brain cells, but there are some changes in your brain cells just by thinking blue. You think about big, complicated mathematical experiences, that'll also change synapses so you can think very clearly, like Einstein, about what is that going in your brain. So every experience changes your brain. Okay, if you put the experience of transcending, where the whole nervous system and the whole mind settles down to its sort of fundamental ground state, a fundamental platform of its existence, and you brain has a chance to become maximally coherent there, and you bring that coherence back into life, you bring that orderliness back into life. You go in, you access the orderliness deep within, and you bring it into life. So whatever you feed the system, that's what it will become. If you feed the system negativity, it will deal with that negativity. If you feed it positivity, it'll deal with the positivity. It's just like a soldier. If you send him to a certain place in war, he'll adapt to survive in war.
Right.
You bring him back home, he'll try to survive in civilian life, and that may be difficult because of lack of plasticity, but it will try to adapt.
Right.
So we're always trying to adapt. If we feed orderliness in, we become more orderly. If we feed noise and stress and disorderly, that's what we become. It's a very simple equation.
Now, in this summit, which is a nice way to put it, thank you, we're talking a little bit about Alzheimer's and prevention of Alzheimer's. Like, what's the mechanism which is reflected in Alzheimer's forming in the brain and the body? Like, from your point of view, what's kind of your take on what's going on there?
Right. So there's all kinds of theories, the earlier ones with amyloid and so forth, which is now being put to the side. And I mean, amyloid is important, but it's not the key thing, okay? And tangles and so forth. And there's this whole issue of inflammation and immune system and so forth. Type 2, type 3 diabetes or something. From my point of view, and if you look at the research literature, the problem with Alzheimer's is a progressive disconnect of the information processing system. And that may seem abstract, but it's actually quite concrete. Your information processing means you have different cells, hundreds of billions of them. They're all collected here, 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 and here. And then they start communicating with each other.
Right.
To give rise to your thoughts and emotions and behavior. Now, given that, what we can think of in aging is that those systems become more and more disorderly. And therefore, the information flow is disorderly, and then we don't function as well on level of the body or our thinking and our happiness and so forth. So with aging, that's what happens. With Alzheimer's, it's just an extreme version of that, where the stress and lack of full brain development allows these networks to become dysfunctional. So if you want to, a simple explanation is that Alzheimer's is basically a network pathology. It's a loss of information flow so that you lose track of where your keys are, then you lose track of your name, then you lose track of who you really are. It's progressive falling apart. So maybe we should talk a little bit about networks so people understand that, but it's really coming down to networks. Now, there are many things impinging on the networks, whether you're stressed, whether your diet is, whether you exercise. There's all these elements people are aware of in the aging process in Alzheimer's. If you exercise more, it's better. If you get a better diet, it's good. If you get some rest and sleep, so forth. So, but all these things feed into one thing. How good is your information processing? How good is your brain adapting to your lifestyle? Because it's all lifestyle. Except for a few percentage, Alzheimer's is all determined by your lifestyle. You could have Alzheimer's all through your lineage, but it depends upon if you're going to get it, what you did for the last 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Your lifestyle is the determinant of Alzheimer's and how bad it is in almost every case.
So it's interesting if you look at it from almost like talking to a computer scientist here as well as a neurologist. So what you're looking at is the way that the system adapts over time, cumulatively. And, you know, one of the themes we've been exploring in the summit is, well, if we could intervene at an earlier stage and change the trajectory of the disease, that would certainly alter the outcome. And it seems like what you're saying is if you have a continuous input at a certain amount of time, at some point, the brain, it's much more difficult for the brain to be connected in an orderly fashion. Is that a fair way to put it?
One could say that the general experience is the older you get, the harder it is to change things in general.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that at 60 or 70, you couldn't learn to play the violin if you really wanted to. It's a matter of motivation and how good the brain is in the networks. At 30, people already can have amyloid plaque. Okay, so amyloid plaque is there at 30 when we have no idea that there's any problem except for that we're not functioning.
Right.
And you could be at 90 years of old and be completely cognitively intact. All right, you're just like a wonderful human being, and then you pass away in your sleep. You look at your brain and find it's completely riddled with amyloid and tangles and stuff like that. And they go, how is that possible? If the brain is this disrupted in terms of these chemicals and so forth and molecules, how could that person be sort of okay? Well, it comes back again to the fact it's all about networks. That person, in the face of all that sort of garbage in the brain, was still able to process information efficiently to overcome that deficit. It's like living in a kitchen that's kind of messy, but you're still a really good cook.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
You'd rather not have a messy kitchen, make it easy for yourself, but you could get away with it. So it really comes down to networks. And if I might take a moment to talk about networks,
Sure.
so people could really understand. So there's these modules, these cells connect together, and then these cells connect together and so forth. There's one set of cells, there's a constellation of densely connected sets of neurons. And they're called, it's a club or association of guys that are connected together. And because of the rich density of connectivity, wiring, and they're related to each other, it's called a rich club. So it's a club of cells that are richly connected. So it's called rich club. So this is a group of cells distributed across the brain in a specific pattern that is the core of who we are. And it's also at the core of aging and Alzheimer's. The core is the core, whether it's good or bad, okay? It's good because it's who we are, it's bad because it's responsible for Alzheimer's. So this core is our dynamic, stable reference point for everything in the body and everything we deal with on the outside. So we take all this change in the body and all this change outside, and we have to remain stable in the midst of all that dynamism. So this is based on slow cortical fluctuations that allow us to process all this other information. So for your people listening, let's think about it in terms of an analogy. There's an airport, okay? In fact, there's many airports. In fact, there's a whole global system of travel, transportation. So let's pick an example. Chicago, that's a big deal. 1,000 flights a day, all right? We'd like to have Chicago working really good. But we also know that there are regional airports, let's say Des Moines, Iowa, and it has like maybe 200 or 300 flights a day, and that feeds into Chicago. And then maybe you don't quite want to leave from Des Moines, you leave from Ottumwa in the east part of the state. So you take a little jumper jet to Des Moines, which then goes to Chicago. So there's really 3 types of airports. There's the big national ones, there's regional, and then there's local. And each one is important, and each one moves people through the system so they can all do what they want to do. And when it all works together, we don't think much about it, and we just enjoy the transportation system. If the local airport goes down, not a big deal, you just drive someplace else. If the regional airport goes down, you got a little bit of a problem here, right? What are you going to do? Okay. If Chicago goes down, and of course in the Midwest, you have thunderstorms in the summer and you have snowstorms in the winter, 1,000 flights get grounded. Everybody in the world is going to know about it very quickly. You have people in London, Moscow, everywhere in the world waiting to get someplace, and Chicago is somewhere that nexus. So you can see that as you move from the peripheral to the central, becomes more and more powerful in terms of the overall guiding influence of controlling information. Same thing's true in the brain. We have local outside peripheral systems related to motor and vision and sensory process. We have feeder systems in the middle, and then we have this rich club. If the peripheral system goes down, maybe you can't move a finger, or you're losing part of your language. If the feeder systems, the middle ones, go out, then there's some more difficulty in thinking. But if the rich club goes out, you have global disconnect. And that is the final thing with Alzheimer's. So what we want to do is make sure that our network system, from the most peripheral to the basic core of who we are handled properly. Because this is a framework. This is who we are. And that Alzheimer's is really just a hub, a rich hub pathology. And that's what the research shows in this example. It's just like air transportation. You can't lose these big hubs. You become too dependent upon them from who we are. And the rich club is who we are, emotionally, cognitively, everything.
And it's interesting as you bring up these points. One of the curiosities with Alzheimer's is some people who, after the fact, they've done autopsies and they've had plenty of amyloid plaque, but they function well. There's one study, it's a famous study called the Nun Study about that. And yet,
He's actually a meditator.
oh, is that right? So funnily enough, when you talk about the core system, which gives us our identity and connects everything, the Rich Club that I never heard of before, it really shows that the more you can continue to reinforce that coherence in the system, you're keeping that global network vibrant and alive, which is pretty fascinating.
On the other side of that story, they showed that nuns, when somebody goes into the nunnery, they write a little statement about who they are, 1 or 2 pages. This is my life. And then based on that, they get stored away in the files in the nunnery and they become a nun. They went back and analyzed all the different pages of this is who I am when they entered and how long they lived and how well they lived. And they found that the complexity of the story they told, the grammar, the wording, the usage, the picking of this and that, the complexity, and as a way of analyzing language, the complexity predicted how long they would live and how quality of life they would have. So not only do you have to maintain a momentum of growth and harmony, but if you have early in your life a very clear, coherent brain, that leads right away as a platform for doing much, much better later in life. So that's why we have to get early on and help people get the very best possible brain. Because it usually takes about the first 22 years of life. And then the brain says, all right, I've done my job. Now that we're going to live our life and I'm not going to do much more. You got what you got. Now with meditation, transcendental meditation, we can reboot that system. But in general, people have the first 25 years of their life for the brain to say, all right, throw whatever you want in the system, get as early as you want to get, and now we're going to cruise the rest of the time. We'll see if we cruise high or we'll cruise low. But what we want to do is change the educational system. So by the time of 25, people have the full developed creative potential. Their brain is maximally coherent. And then they'll just go, 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 go.
That's quite a vision. And thank you for sharing that.
Research. It's been shown with research. Yep.
Thanks for sharing that perspective, Dr. Alaric, on TM, research, reversal of the aging process, and living a great and wonderful life. Thank you, Alaric, for joining us. Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Michael.